I'm Ben Ryman, and this is Behaviour Speak.
And then somebody said something really beautifully simple. And I said, it's sort of like if somebody were to steal your car and every time they saw you, they said, "Hey, I'm sorry I stole your car. It's it's a beautiful car. It works really, really well. Um, I enjoy driving it to work. It's super handy for vacations, and yeah, I'm gonna keep it. But I just want to acknowledge that I stole your car. Um, once again, yeah." And so it's sort of like, yeah,
Wow.
I guess you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it really hits people in the absence of truly understanding the intention of why you're acknowledging the land. We don't talk about the fact that settler colonization is a structure and not an event, and that the structure operates around us all the time, doing exactly what it intended to do. And there's a machinery behind the structure of colonization that's working very, very hard to keep people exactly where they are, doing exactly what they're doing, so that the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from themselves, their communities, and their lands continues. And we've reached that objective of the erasure, the eradication of Indigenous peoples writ large.
Hey everybody. Today's conversation is one that stayed with me long after we hit stop. My guest is Dr. Tibetha Kemble, a member of the Piapot First Nation, educator, health leader, and someone who brings both clarity and compassion to difficult conversations about colonization, identity, and healing. We explore everything from the meaning and limitations of land acknowledgements to how settler colonialism operates not as a moment in history, but as an ongoing structure. Tibetha shares powerful insights about intention, relationship to land, intergenerational trauma and privilege, and what it really means to do the deeper work of reconciliation. This is not a comfortable conversation, and it isn't meant to be. It invites us to sit with discomfort rather than rush to resolve it, and take a more honest look at our role in the systems we're a part of. We also hear Tibetha's personal story, her journey through the 60s scoop, finding her way back to community, and building a life rooted in purpose and service. If you're willing to listen openly and reflect honestly, I think you'll find this conversation as meaningful as I did. Tibetha, welcome to Behaviour Speak.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Before we start, we're going to be talking about kind of a variety of topics, and you're in a lot of really cool spaces. One thing you and I talked a lot about was this whole settler colonialism, and so I thought it'd be good to just share a little bit about my own positionality in this conversation. I spent an hour yesterday with Len Pierre of Len Pierre Consulting. He's from the Piapot First Nation, and he was doing a lab on territorial acknowledgements, and kind of he had some folks from different nations there, and talking about whether they should do them at all or have them at all, and and I know there's a lot of differing opinions, and
Yeah.
for a long time I've been doing them on the podcast before every conversation, and I think they've kind of become a bit rote and a little performative. And it's interesting, he sort of described performative as not being such a bad word. He says, we do lots of things that are performative. Manners are performative. Please and thank you is performative. And he was kind of comparing territorial acknowledgements to manners. And, he says you should still have manners, even though they're performative. Cause it's respectful. And so, I think he was trying to help folks not get so stuck in their heads about everything. And, but at the same time, I kind of felt like I was being, like, what was my intention behind doing it? And so I've been reading a lot and trying to think about how I still want to keep doing something like that. He was talking more in the context of, I think, like when people hold public events or even in sort of staff meetings or meetings, and I think someone asked, should I do it at every staff meeting and every, team meeting? And they said, well, no, I mean, you probably don't need to, but if you have a guest at a meeting, then it's a good thing. And the idea being that the whole sort of intent of these things in the first place was just to be whenever someone is in someone else's house or someone else's land, you should let them know who you are and what you're doing there, and where you came from.
Yes.
And so I started thinking, well, I have a new guest every single time I do this thing.
Mm.
But at the same time, the listeners are the same people every time, for the most part. I mean, hopefully that's changing. Hopefully there's a few new folks each time. And so I've been thinking about, I do this with every guest. So it's not regardless of their background. And so it's a bit of a coincidence that, you happen to be Indigenous. I'm thinking about this more, but you could have been. I think my next guest is from Russia. I'd probably still be having the same conversation right now. I'd probably still be bringing this up, although they might understand it less. And so I've been thinking, I know I'm a settler. I know I'm uninvited. I know I'm occupying. I believe I live in Gillies Bay on Texada Island, which is west coast of BC, in between Vancouver Island and the Upper Sunshine Coast. But the traditional lands are the Colonial Nation, the Clayus, Homoko, and Comox. I think sometimes they're called the sister nations or four sister nations. And if I go to that nativelands.ca website, you'll see little blotches of all of them all over Texada.
Yeah.
And when I look up, they call Texada in that interesting sort of phonetic spelling, Sayayin, and they call Gillies Bay Isum, which I believe means like land near water or something like that. It's original. Yeah, but I've had a lot of really cool folks on the podcast, really cool, diverse, and I've really tried to learn more about sort of Indigenous history through all these different folks I've been having on, but I still know so little about where I am.
Mm.
Which maybe means I need to have someone on the podcast and learn a little more. But yeah, so I think, we're going to be talking about topics that are, and also I've been thinking more about my own heritage too. And I like how a lot of the Indigenous folks I've had on talk about lineages and this connection to, I had this guest on, she's a kind of public health researcher in Seattle, and she studies, her name is Meenakshi Richardson, and she studies urban Indigenous sort of everything related to kind of being urban. And she was talking about how when some folks are struggling, it's harder to connect in these urban situations because everybody's from different communities, all kind of coming in, and yet at the same time there can be this really neat, you can make some really good connections with folks from different tribes, different nations, and get a lot of that support. And we were kind of comparing this to my wife's family in Ontario, and that's a woman. She's all alone and has no one besides my wife, who's on the other side of the world, and how great it would be for her if she could connect with all these people locally, just by nature of that's the way they've always done things.
Mm.
And how that's missing. And it got me thinking just more about how little I know about my history and my family, and how little we, in general, I think we European sort of descent folks, reflect on our heritage and our ancestors.
Interesting insight. There's so many threads in there that I can touch on just even briefly. A couple of years ago, I was in a executive coaching program in Victoria, and there was a lot of kerfuffle about land acknowledgements and where do we do them and how do we do them and why do we do them. And I remember at the time somebody telling me, or I was reflecting, and I picked up somewhere, doing a land acknowledgement without exploring what you had talked about, which is intention. Like, what is the intention for acknowledging the land? In the absence of that, it does feel performative. It hollows out really the primary purpose and intent of acknowledging the land, which is to remind us of who it belongs to and who the land belongs to, and who belongs to the land. And then somebody said something really beautifully simple. And they said, it's sort of like if somebody were to steal your car, and every time they saw you, they said, "Hey, I'm sorry I stole your car. It's a beautiful car. It works really, really well. Um, I enjoy driving it to work. It's super handy for vacations. And yeah, I'm gonna keep it. But I just want to acknowledge that I stole your car once again. Yeah. And so it's sort of like, yeah, I guess you know what I mean? Like it really hits people in the absence of truly understand the intention of why you're acknowledging the land. But then that, I taught this past term, I taught Indigenous research methodologies. And at the core of that work, doing Indigenous research is the central importance of intention, really knowing why you're doing what you're doing. And I would share with my, I guess, co-learners in that space that I remember, and I didn't understand at the time, and it used to drive me up the wall, but like my graduate supervisor would always be like, but why? But why do you want to look at this question? Why does that and it was always around intention, understanding if I am coming at it in a good way with good intentions, and that I understood my connection to it, because there has to be a personal connection. And so it's Margaret Kovach, who writes about, all that we can know for certain is our own experience. And so when you connect those two learnings together, intention and your own experience, your own connection to whatever it is that you're thinking about or talking about, you end up grounding it in a good way. And so land acknowledgements, for me, when people talk about sort of struggling with them, I always think about intention and position. And when people spend time understanding their genealogy of not only knowledge, but privilege, and can articulate it and approach it with intention, it hits a bit differently. I've written I wrote a short sort of opinion piece on land acknowledgements too, and I can't remember what it's called now. I was much angrier back then, but it was really about how like used to get invited to do land acknowledgements, but and I've since stopped being invited to do land acknowledgements precisely because of what I evoke, the emotional sort of responses in people. And we'll talk more about this later because that's sort of what drew us into this space. But so people stopped inviting me precisely because of the emotions that would arise in settlers around guilt and blame and all of that. And then I think sort of the final piece is for me, I think now when people ask me to do land acknowledgements now, I think about like it's a process of reclamation. Like I was separated from my community of origin, the land that I belonged to as an infant. And the journey back to understanding my connection to space and place and people is a privilege that was taken from me. And so I have a right to do the work to reclaim it. But I also have the right to maybe not know, like to exist in this space of, I don't know. And I don't know why I don't feel connected to the land the way that everybody thinks and says I should be. I don't. And so, I'm okay to exist in the space of like complex personhood, the way that Eve talks about it, right? Like I can be full of contradictions and still be respectful, hold space for that then. Yeah. So you don't need to acknowledge through that lens and through that framework.
And Len, who I talked about I went to see on Monday, he talks about territory acknowledgement versus land acknowledgement, because it's not about the land. It's about this relationship to it. And yeah. So I know I don't need to do a land acknowledgement. But I wonder if, and granted, I don't know that I'm looking at the time here, I don't know that I have 25 minutes at the beginning of every podcast
to unpack.
To unpack my connection and relationship to the land. And nor should I demand that of each guest. But at the same time, I feel like I still want to do something to model, a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, the land issue happening in BC right now is an interesting one, and I think occupies the settler imagination in ways that is quite disruptive to many things that I think are taken for granted, and that are exposing, I guess, fault lines in their own concept of themselves about what's theirs and what's not. And maybe this is an appropriate corollary to it, but I remember somebody saying once that it's almost impossible for men to imagine having a friendship with a woman because they can't conceive of a relationship that whose primary intent isn't just sexual. And so when I think about, settlers and understanding of loss of land, like they can't even, the rupture comes because they can't understand that it's possible to exist in partnership and in relationship in ways that aren't possessive.
Yes.
And I remember just it was such a powerful term this last year. There's so many things that I've learned from the people that I get to teach and learn alongside. But in one of my courses, predominantly it was around Indigenous people, like contemporary issues in Indigenous people's education. Predominantly non-Indigenous students take the course, and sometimes I have one or two. This class, I had 7 or 8 Indigenous folks in that class, which is out of 40 or 35 or 40. So quite a bit. And so a lot of my teaching, a lot of the readings that we do, and I started off the course by saying, like, you need to trust me. This is going to hurt a little bit in the beginning. Like the readings are going to be really hard and it's going to hurt. Our conversations are going to be disruptive. They're going to really rub up against the parts of you that you've maybe never thought about or touched on. But we're going to come around the other side and we're going to come down and we're going to come back together. It'll be fine. So you have to trust me. So in one of the dialogues, it was really about confronting intergenerational or historical privilege that accumulates over time. And kids had not even considered the generational privilege that they had inherited. So much like Indigenous peoples, we have, intergenerational trauma or inherited trauma as a result of not only historical but ongoing colonization. Settlers have intergenerational privilege that they don't talk about. And so in one of the dialogues that we had in class, one of my questions to them was like, so far, I've not met a settler who's willing to lose something for me. And so what are you willing to lose? And many of them started to talk, around the edges of, this or that, or I can do this. And then one of the Indigenous learners raised their hand and said, like, how much more do I have to lose? And I was like, wow, I hadn't thought about, like, we have lost so much and asked for very little compensation or very little restitution. So and most of the time, and we have, Section 35 rights, that box of rights is largely empty. Indigenous peoples have to go and define what those rights are and then defend them and then take cities to court, to take provinces to court in order to assert those rights, those defined rights. And then when that actually actualizes, settlers haven't done the work to understand their role, their part of that partnership, and then what they're willing to lose. And so, what the case is actually calling forward is like, they're not going to come for their houses, but what if they did, like what made your dispossession of our lands just and our dispossession of your houses and lands unjust? The hypocrisy in that and not being willing or able to explore the hypocrisy of that. And, there's always, well, I didn't do that. And, but you inherited the thinking, you inherited the privilege, you inherited the wealth, and so you can't have one. And then, on the other side say, you can't take it. You know what I mean? So it's an interesting dialogue. And I just don't think people are willing to explore what they're willing to lose in a humble, honest way.
No. And I think if you did explore that, like I may explore that after this probably, is what would you gain? I mean, I think if we all just gave up this individualistic sort of take attitude and just decided, okay, I relinquish. I had a guest on, the episode was Julie Smith Ulanimi, and she's Indigenous, and she talks about projects she was doing where around sort of helping non-Indigenous folks connect to the culture in their local communities, and she would invite these folks. It was sort of like she'd invite 5 or 6 of these folks, and they'd come. I think it was a research study. It just 6 or 7 non-Indigenous folks would come and live on the reservation for 2 weeks and be a part of everything, immersed. There was certainly some ceremonial aspects that they weren't invited to, of course, but they were immersed. I would love to do that in our local First Nation, go live there and be a part of that, and they got funding for it, and it just made me think, if folks, had the opportunity to live in a different way and see what it would be like if, I think, and as I learn more to share and cooperate, I see the value, and I think I wonder if folks could get past that fear, would they see a win somehow, or is it too ingrained because of the intergenerational privilege, the generation of generation? Is it too much to because the whole 7 generations to get over the trauma theory? Yeah, I've heard that. I had a Cree social worker come on and tell me, she was in Alberta. She came and told me that she had her the daughter was the 4th generation. We're just talking about how all the things she hoped for her daughter, and all the growth she's had, and how her daughter has been able to experience some of these things from birth that she didn't get to experience as a child in relation to connection to community. And, could there be a similar path for us with the intergenerational privilege?
Maybe I'll go back to, have you ever read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer?
I've heard lots of good things about it.
So in Braiding Sweetgrass, there's one chapter that's called The Honorable Harvest. And it's my favorite chapter, and I read it over and over and over again. And I share it with as many people as possible, because she talks a lot about how disconnected we are from each other, and really from the rituals of consumption that we take for granted. But there's one part where she talks about, there's sort of like a very simple rule, like never be the first to take and never be the last. And for me, when I think about consumption and mass consumption and overconsumption, I sat with that for a while, because like, first of all, how do you know you're the first? And how do you know you're the last? And so what that calls on you to do is to always be hyper vigilant of not over consuming or not taking too much, or making sure that there's always something for somebody behind you. And even if you don't know who they are or whatever. So for me, that was an important lesson, because you just have to always hold that space of intention, right? So we're turning back to where we started, around really being intentional about what we do, what we say, how we consume, what we consume. But I think what I had sort of a come to Jesus moment about a decade ago, more than a decade ago, where my family and I, at the time, we lost everything, and all of the things that I had come to rely on to help distract me from myself, from what I was thinking and feeling, being able to buy myself into distraction, was gone. We just didn't have any resources left. And it was in that prolonged space of, well, I don't see it as deprivation, but just prolonged space of opening up my awareness to my reliance on consumption to distract me from the very real deep work of inner knowing. It was in that space and that time where I sort of reevaluated my relationship to things and to why I needed things. And I think for settlers, I think so too. I agree that there's like a 7 generation thing that's going to happen. But underneath all of that, and what I even talked about before, was there has to be a willingness to do the heavy lifting, because what it's calling on settlers to do in relationships. So we have our 7 generations moving forward. We're doing our best to heal. At the same time, I don't know that there's a same realization that settler colonization has also had an impact on settlers and how they continue to act and react and behave in this time and space. It's just sort of taken for granted. Like, this is just how we do things. And there's no intentionality to understanding, how do we arrest this forward moving train of colonization, and my role as a settler in that. The hard part is sitting with the very hard tension of, like, how does my lack of understanding about land and ownership and partnership and relationship and consumption and how does my understanding of that affect me as a good relational partner going forward? We're not doing that work. We're doing sort of small p program reconciliation work, right? Like host a round dance and have a beating circle, but not the heavy attentive and attending to the wounding of settlers that, like, you guys carry forward a trauma that is also quite unique, that drives your behavior forward too,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all the things that are happening in the US right now politically and language I think a lot of the people on the left are using to describe people on the right as being unintelligent and so on. These people aren't unintelligent, but they have this generational privilege and belief that this is the way things are supposed to be. There are the systems that support racism and sexism and all these things also support their trauma and their privilege and all the things that are going on for them and so I've more recently in life I've tried not to judge and try to sort of how can we help, what does that heavy lifting look like, or what can that heavy lifting, how do we start that heavy lifting for these folks,
Yeah, I mean,
without alienating them more, right?
mhm. So one of the challenges, I think, is that we don't talk about the fact that settler colonization is a structure and not an event, and that the structure operates around us all the time, doing exactly what it intended to do. And there's a machinery behind the structure of colonization that's working very, very hard to keep people exactly where they are, doing exactly what they're doing, so that the dispossession of Indigenous peoples from themselves, their communities, and their lands continues, and we've reached that objective of the erasure, the eradication of Indigenous peoples writ large. And in the beginning, when Sir John A. Macdonald said, I want to continue until there's not an Indian left, that was a very outward, overt claim. And the genocide that took place in residential school is how that manifested, how it rolled out. How it continues on today is much more nuanced. It's so subtle. And we talk about, systemic discrimination, systemic racism, and yet people can't quite put their finger on it, right? Because it shapeshifts all the time, so that it remains obscure and obscured from our vision. We can't ever really put our hands on it, and so people are like, "Well, I don't know where to start. What do I do?" And then we sort of trick ourselves into thinking and believing that our way out of this is just through education. Like, we just have to keep teaching you about all of the ways, right? But it's helping people see that they're existing within a carefully constructed infrastructure designed to keep them, spouting out the racism and the really limited viewpoints. And that's the hard part, is that, yes, I can continue to educate you about all of the ways that colonization has operated, how it operates today in child welfare and justice and education and all of the spaces. And you can take all of that and you can go like, well, I have no idea where to start. What do I do with that? Like, how do I move how as a cog in the machine do I do anything? And so then you get that sort of static, nobody's moving anything, and then we host the round dance and do the beating circle instead, right? Because we think that that's movement forward, and people think it's movement forward because they feel something, right? And so settler colonization really relies on settlers maintaining this illusion of doing good, and as long as they're doing good, and as long as they feel something, then they can't be harming, right? But we're all part of these larger infrastructure, this larger system of colonization, or structure of colonization, sorry. And so for me, it's about education, but for me, it's about helping to define and describe what that structure of colonization looks like, and how these events have kept that structure moving forward, doing exactly what it's intended to do. And then within specific professions, how those professions maintain the architecture and keep it moving forward in a certain way. And then, but then it's up to the individuals themselves within that system to define how they're going to lose something in order to disrupt colonization. And what that looks like in, Tabor, Alberta, I can't know. Or, Okotoks, or I can't define that. But for me, it's going all the way back up and starting with that, this is the infrastructure that's been carefully constructed over a couple of centuries now. And here's how it has shape shifted over time in the language the government uses and continues to use, in the way that programs are designed and the way that programs are delivered, the sort of constant chasing ghosts toward this illusion of progress, towards justice. It's taking it all the way back up and then helping people understand their role within it, and then allowing them space to either, because I can't control another person's behavior. So whether or not they pick up the tools that I'm putting down, it's up to them. But it's that helping people to come to that very hard realization, and then that deep inner work of exploring their how they operationalize it daily, that's hard. On a much more relational level, I mean, one would think that, my network of relationships and people is all Indigenous, and it's not. I have a lot of non-Indigenous relatives who come from those smaller places. And it's the gentle invitation, should that arise, to have a conversation about colonization and moving it forward, how they're moving it forward. But that's all I can do. I think I have tried to do it fairly well over the last couple of decades, but yeah.
Hmm. When we met before, you talked about this kind of idea
Yeah.
of settler illness and then settler healing. Can you talk about?
Well, it sort of came up because I had been in a couple of circles around in Indigenous people's health, and they were talking circles, and I think the discussion was around intergenerational trauma. And as we were making our way around the circle, a settler said, I'm really tired. I'm so tired of talking about the same thing over and over and over again. And can't we move on? And I much prefer to, learn about your culture and learn your traditions rather than just always focusing on the negative. I don't like the way that focusing on the negative makes me feel. And then, went around the circle, and the elder eventually shared, and in the way that they do, she just said very beautifully and succinctly, she said, I see intergenerational trauma as harm after unresolved harm. And that that moment stayed with me, and I sat with that conversation for a couple of years. And I thought to myself, from because I also have, relatives who are in recovery. And one of the principal tenets of recovery is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. And I thought to myself, if the elders' words are absolutely true and valid, if we keep being harmed over and over and over again, and we're doing all of this work and to heal ourselves and for future generations, but settlers keep going down this path and we keep getting harmed. And why aren't we also attending to the illness that seems to be settled in with settlers? But they keep harming us without attending to it because there's so much focus on let's help you heal, Indigenous person. And for me, I'm don't worry about it. We got it. You manage your side of the street. We'll manage ours. For the most part, they're so focused on making sure that we're healed, but they keep harming us. And so it's well, at what point are we going to pivot and ask you to take a really close look at the really the insanity of your behavior, of wanting us to be something different, wanting us to be whatever you have in mind, and us for generations resisting. And this idea of it's survivance, right? Of more than just surviving, but of like resistance and survival all at the same time. Like we're doing all of that work. At what point does that settler colonial relationship come together and and settlers have done the work to say like, here's how I am like not not doing the heavy lifting. And here's how I'm going to heal myself in order to move it forward. And I remember at the time I was still really struggling with it. And I don't know why. And I'm probably going to get a lot of hate comments for this afterwards, but I was like leaning into Chat GPT and AI. And I was like, can we define this as like a collective illness? And this is, your mind's going to be blown, but it was arguing with me. And at the end of it, it said, your framework is not productive. And so for many reasons, I thought, well, first of all, like AI is obviously very biased, but even AI is trying to pull forward this sustained relationship where we do all the healing and we're the ones who are supposed to, turn the other cheek at every turn, and that we're supposed to be productive and not resistant, and so I've sat with that idea of like it is a collective illness when only one side is managing their responsibilities to maintain the relationship in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, if I think that's so important because I think if we see you healing or healed, that's, if that's a final goal of some sort, then we're forgiven,
Mm,
right? If you're over it, because
mm,
well, then if we're equating healed with over it, as if those are the
mm.
same thing,
Yeah.
then we don't have to take responsibility anymore, and we can, as you said before, we can get off the negative topics and focus on you know, the beating and the circles.
Right. There's absolution in it. But then why do you keep harming? Why do you keep apprehending our kids? And why do you keep incarcerating our women? And why isn't the same amount of funding for Indigenous languages the same as it is for French language? Oops, did I say that out loud?
It's so true. I mean, well, this is where, yeah, I mean, why?
Hmm.
There's no good reason except, like you said, because I've heard these conversations are so similar to the ones I've had a lot of different Black folks on and talking about kind of Black history in North America. Some of the examples that they've shared around, like there's one story I've heard a few times around communities quite literally designed to keep folks out, and so we don't have a bridge here, or we took this bridge down to keep you out. And, we designed this area for you, and this, this sort of built in these communities, sort of intentional community building and design for segregation and seclusion. Some of these are so overt, like they're right in our face that these systems that are a problem, and yet, like I think about police, and
Mm,
like you said, it sort of, it starts with arresting and eventually incarceration. Incarceration, I mean, some of the laws are so antiquated, right? Sometimes it just seems impossible. It seems like these systems are so built up.
no, that's okay. Let's maybe stay in the space of the illness space. So I also think about it as through the lens of like codependency. So like codependency is like, I need you to keep acting this way so I can keep acting in this way. A lot of the systemic or the structural things that we are trying to address is really just the pushing and the pulling around people wanting us to stay exactly as we are in this sort of codependent relationship. I need you to stay sick so that I can keep doing this, and I need you to keep doing this. And so it's easier for me to understand it through that lens. It's like, as long as everybody stays fixed in their fixed position within the relationship, everything will keep going forward. A lot of people can't see it though, right? They don't see the lost side of the forest for the trees. But and a lot of the work that we are compelled to do is attending to the very immediate manifestations of the lack of healing between the relationship, right? So attending to and advancing very small P programs that don't change anything whatsoever, but help people feel good about just the illusion of progress moving forward. It is there's so many distractions that take up so much of our time. And so in a lot of the work that I do, and I'm so grateful to be back in a position now of like working alongside and leading alongside other Indigenous people, is through my own sort of reflection and understanding now, is to say like that this relationship wants us to be distracted by how angry we should be about all of this. We can hold space for anger and not attend to trying to defend and make people aware and all of like, this is the normative model. We can instead hold space for that, but still actually advance what it is that we want, getting into that space of futurisms. Because for like a lot of the lack of progress over the last 50 to 60 years is because we have been so consumed with attending to the hurt and the harm. And if we disembed ourselves from that relationship, instead do some of the small P defending work, whatever, but what happens if the majority of our work is focused on the future and like just going like, we're not engaging in that anymore. It's interesting what happens when you disembed yourself from that relationship. People are very much like, wait a second. And then you get pushback. But at the same time, when we come together as a collective and we work together and we're all headed in the same direction with the same understanding of not being distracted, seeing the codependent relationship for what it is, seeing like really rendering visible what it is that we're sort of this architecture, puppetry that we've been asked to participate in for so long. If we honor, acknowledge, and respect that, yet still focus on the future, we can attend to things on a much more systemic, structural way, right? We're not so consumed by the minutia of the immediate distraction from the harm.
It would be nice if that battle could be won, that everyone would acknowledge and agree that, acknowledging the past and taking responsibility for, what we as settlers have done and the disease that we've created. Or, and if this is kind of what you're saying, we can be aware of that, but if we focus more on how we can move people forward and look at the future, I think people are going to buy into that more. And I'm not talking about people, say, like myself, but people who are kind of more on that sort of right side of thinking that are never going to accept that, their grandparents did the wrong thing. They're a part of this. They're a cog in this system that's ever causing harm. They might be able to buy into it. If we're not going to talk about that forever, I'm willing to work towards, more inclusion and opportunity and collaboration and cooperation going forward. I mean, I don't think this is an ideal path because, we are ignoring and not taking responsibility and accountability for all of the harm we've caused and continue to cause. But in sort of a pragmatic angle, I don't know that anyone's ever going to finally get to this point of, I mean, I have, but that doesn't mean much in the whole scheme of things. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's this maybe assumption that it all has to be reconciled and that like everything has to be harmonious. And show me a point in history that, maybe it's not intended to be that way. And it's okay for us to hold space for the very real understanding that people coexisting, there will be conflict. There will be people who will never want to understand. There will be people who will want to advance the work like what you're doing. What I'm saying about even my own direction and the direction of the folks that I work alongside, we're just not interested in whether, Frank, who owns the hardware store, is willing to do reconciliation work. I'm just not interested in whether or not Frank picks up the tools. Because Frank will do what Frank wants to do. I think part of the work is for Frank's community, for those who are critically engaged and understand to help Frank if that's what Frank wants to do. But I can't compel somebody to want to be a good relative. They have to decide. And their community has to be able to support them in that space. But it's not going to be, Tibetha out in the front lines going, "Hey, Frank." Yeah.
Are you seeing people doing that work towards settler healing?
Yeah. I see it within institutions. That's where I'm mostly operate. Finding a lot of, and I've been doing this work long enough to talk about, shifts in what I'm seeing and experiencing over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Like I was just sharing with a girlfriend on the weekend about, I worked for the Department of Indian Affairs when Harper was in power. Those are dark times. And I remember, being a field services officer, engaging with nations and communities in and around Treaty 6 about their funding arrangements and how much the conversation was like pleading for the government to see to see the impact of structural neglect, to see the impacts of state-imposed poverty and just the direct conflict. It was so conflict-ridden all the time. To being in Alberta and working for the provincial government during the Notley years and just how much of a shift that was. And then even when I work with nations now, the conversations that they're having with the feds and with the provinces all very much like, you don't have to tell us anymore about what it is that we've done and we continue to do. And we're going to provide some funding. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not going to change 150 years of colonization, but the shifts are notable to me. They're noticeable to me, which is good. So at that sort of higher level, I see it. What I'm starting to see on the ground are how individual leaders are starting to take it up and change their behavior in relationship and use their power to push down within their own institutions to say, that's not how we do it. This is how we do it. And if I come forward to an institution and say, like, this is what I need you to do for me, and then for them to go, okay, and then go and do the thing, and then to come back and say, okay, the path is clear now, you can go. And I'm like, I would say there are 3 spaces that come to my mind immediately where they're picking up the tools to make change institutionally, because they know that the Franks aren't going to pick up the Frank isn't going to, bend, but if the leader changes the structure and the architecture to allow me to live more freely and to work more freely, that's what they do. And it's mind blowing. At first, I was like, wait a second. Well, I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop to go like, okay, well, that was a first step, but it's sustained and so that's a beautiful space to be in. And yeah, so we talked about Grant when we first joined online, and like Grant was the first person to invite me into the space for WICRI, the Women and Children's Health Research Institute. And I was very reluctant. I thought, oh, I'll just join sort of passively. I'll join this institution sort of passively. Soon came to realize that it was much more than a passive membership, and their co-leadership and co-stewardship of the space and the heavy lifting that they do on our behalf and the learning that they do in order to walk alongside us in good relation is new. It's welcome. I would say that's how I'm seeing it happen in and around the spaces that I'm in.
WICRI, what is that?
Women and Children's Health Research Institute. So it's an institute within the Faculty of Medicine in the College of Health Sciences at the U of A. Only institute in Canada. And so Grant leads the Indigenous child health portfolio, and I lead the Indigenous women's health portfolio. And yeah, they're doing really good work. And there was some other work too with the Royal College. They're doing a really impressive work to make sure that Indigenous folks who qualify and who are awarded grants can do the work in, well, I mean, unconventional perhaps within the Western framework, but very conventional and necessary within our framework to allow us to do the work unencumbered and in ways that allow us to maintain good relations with the people and communities that we work with. And in little pockets, even just yesterday, I was at a session for the CIHR, Canadian Institutes for Health Research, and even like their leader of one particular portfolio area is doing some really great work to compensate, like welcoming elders, compensating elders, welcoming Indigenous peoples, really creating space and dialogue for Indigenous peoples to coexist in anti-oppressive ways. Like it just keeps showing up, and those things don't make the headlines, but they sit in my heart and my mind. And then when I share that with other Indigenous peoples, they, you know, have a little bit more trust and faith. And so, maybe that's the generational part that you're talking about, is that's how we maybe move it forward together as individual actors, and talking about the structure of colonization and having people see their part and their role, what they can do.
I realize I started this thing by talking about me and my heritage and where I'm from and where I live.
Are we going to work backwards?
Yeah,
Okay.
I clearly left out the most important part about dealing with other folks, is also learning about them. So
Mm,
you've shared a little bit about some of the work you're doing. Tell me a little bit more about you
sure.
and your name, even your name. I mean, it's yeah,
We just launched right into it.
it's
And I didn't even stop. Like, usually I'm pretty good at like
yeah.
going like, okay, cool. Well, I mean, it's a circle. We come back to where we started. So thank you, Ben, for having me. My name is Tibetha. I'm a registered member of the Piapot First Nation located in Treaty 4 territory. I'm a grateful guest here in Treaty 6, and I call St. Albert home. I was brought to Alberta in the late 1970s through what's now known as the 60 Scoop, and I was raised I was raised in Edmonton alongside my adoptive brother Braden, who's from the Saddle Lake Cree Nation. And we were raised by two non-Indigenous expatriates from the United States who had come to Canada to escape the war. And they were I don't want to say crazy hippies, but they were very liberal-minded folks, and they did the absolute best they could to support us and to try and maintain our connections to identity. And I had a fairly, well, I don't know if it's typical or atypical sort of upbringing here in Alberta. As an visibly a First Nations person growing up in the early 80s, I a lot of shame around my identity and what I looked like and who I was and where I came from, and then really shunned that part of myself until I was in my early 20s and I was living in Vancouver at the time. And I made the connection back to my community in my early 20s and came back here to Edmonton. My adoptive mother died when I was 15, and right before I started high school, and so didn't have very much success in high school, and left school before completing. I think I left with about a grade 9 or grade 10 education. And so in those years, I worked, and worked pretty hand to mouth, as you can imagine, without any education. And then when I moved back to Edmonton, I truly trust that the creator is in my life and has always been in my life and has been gently guiding me in the next indicated step. For whatever reason, had managed to like save money. And I'm a spender. I'm not a saver, but I don't know why I saved money, but I said save like enough money to pay for first year tuition to a diploma program at NAIT. And when I got back, I applied and started my education again. And did my diploma and then used that to bridge into an undergraduate degree at the University of Lethbridge when they had a campus here in Edmonton, and then finished that and used that to bridge into a master's and a master's to PhD. And I finished my PhD in 2021, just a few months before my late father passed away. And it took me 20 years to do it all. And throughout that, I worked full time. The only time I took off was a year after I gave birth to my daughter Natanis, who will be 18 in July. Blows my mind. Um, And, when I was at NAIT doing my diploma, somebody from the federal government came along and said, here's this work program that we think you should apply for. And so I applied, and that's where I got my first job as a summer student working for the Department of Indian Affairs. And, you know, you talk to any Indigenous person who's worked for the feds, they have wildly different opinions. For some people, it was the worst experience. For others, it was the best. Looking back on it now, again, the creator was with me the whole time. I think just opening up little parts in order for me to understand the way that I understand the world now. Pardon me. And they started me off doing, I don't know why, like, why would they give this to a kid and to a summer student? But they must have had more work than they had people. But they assigned me to the social data unit. And there's a social assistance policy manual, national one, and nations have to, when they give their membership social assistance, they have to align their claims with the manual. So I would get stacks, like literally stacks of claims on a monthly basis, and I would have to go through each claim to verify that it would match the policy manual. And I learned so much about how policy can be two things. It could be a tool for oppression, but it can also be a tool of resistance. And so what I saw in those spaces was both. Like communities were using and manipulating the policy in order to survive. And while at the same time, the government was trying to use it as a tool to oppress. And so and I moved from social policy to field services, where I got a really robust understanding of like history and how to engage safely and respectfully and how to build relationship and community, and then into education. And then from education at the federal level, I moved over to the province and had a mentor there who believed in me more than I believed in myself and just put me in charge of things and allowed me to lead. And then I moved from that into post-secondary leadership, and where I got to work alongside some incredible people and learning really what it means to be a good relative and how to lead as an Indigenous person and a good relative. And so from that, in and out of Indigenous health, but like I've said to other people before, like you try to leave Indigenous health, but it becomes your heart. You see how all of the systemic inequities show up at the doorstep of our health outcomes. And so to be able to take all of that, to take experience and education and the way that I see the world and the way that I see that infrastructure, and to take it all and to apply it into a role like the roles that I have now, is the gift of a lifetime. And so right now I'm the interim director, executive director of the Wapanakachos Indigenous Health Program. Um, I'm also the academic lead for the Indigenous Women's Health Portfolio at Wickery. I'm also the director of Indigenous Clinical Trials through the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. And I teach in the Faculty of Education, which is where I got my PhD. So it is a full, robust portfolio that keeps me on my toes. But it is like an honor and a privilege to be tired by the work that I love to do. And I'm not tired. I'm just full. Yeah. And so that's me. So like I said, I have a daughter. I'm also like I don't have any living parents anymore. So it's just my brother and I and our children. And so how we create community and family is an ongoing and evolving dynamic. And yeah, that's where I'm at.
That's amazing. Did you ever connect with the birth family?
There was some restrictions on being able to access my birth records for a very long time, and then that opened up, and so I requested those. And so I know my mother's name. I got to see her handwriting because I got the full package, right? So I got every record related to her surrendering me. So I got to see her handwriting and I got to see her parents' handwriting, but I don't believe that she's still around. When I inquire with the band, nobody knows where she is. And I don't know she was 14. So I just have hats off and just deep respect to my birth mother, who was 14 when she gave birth to me. And I was a 9-pound or 10-pound baby with a 99th percentile head. Hats off. Like that is not an easy thing to do. But I can't imagine what she must have gone through in the years after that. Because nothing is ever really provided to Indigenous women who have their children apprehended, right? And the magnitude of trauma that comes from loss in that way. Like it's a lot of the work that I do in and around the birth alert space is talking about how there's a lot of infrastructure and supports provided to women who lose their children during childbirth, and lots of mental health supports to uplift and make sure that they're okay for a long period of time after that trauma happens. But for an Indigenous woman whose child is apprehended, can you imagine the trauma and the grief that would come from that? And no, there are no supports provided. And so I often think about how my mother navigated that at such a young age after it happened, and how and if she coped. And yeah, just a lot of compassion for her in that space.
Sorry, I've heard the term. What do you mean by birth alert?
Oh, yeah. So it's an extension of the residential school era. As residential schools started to close in the 60s, rather than sending a lot of the children home, what the federal government would do, there were also at the same time, there were some amendments to the Indian Act that called Section 80, I think it's Section 88, or where it basically whatever the Indian Act doesn't describe, or the provincial laws then become applicable. So within child welfare, because there's nothing in the Indian Act around child welfare, provincial laws applied in that instance. And so as the residential schools started to close, the federal government then gave the provinces authority to determine, whether or not Indigenous children were quote unquote at risk. And so they would go and do assessments on the parental home. And as you can imagine, 100 years of state sanctioned poverty and dislocation and dispossession, their homes probably didn't meet the mark. And so that determination, that quote unquote determination of risk, provided the foundation for the mass apprehension and removal of Indigenous children from across the country. And so we see that show up in, in some cases, the incremental rise and disproportionate overrepresentation of Indigenous children that we see in quote unquote state care today. But one of the, going all the way back to what we talked about, the settler colonization is a structure, not an event, and that it shape shifts over time and it needs different mechanisms in order to move forward. All of these policy interventions, Indian residential schools, changing the Indian Act, provincial laws about all of those mechanisms to keep the thing moving forward. One of those was what's called birth alert. So an Indigenous woman would show up for, prenatal care or would show up at the hospital. An assessment would be done before a mother gives birth by probably a non-Indigenous social worker. And they would say, well, she doesn't have housing or clean clothes or transportation or whatever, and therefore we believe that when the baby is born that they're going to be at risk of being neglected. And so there's a flag placed on their health record, and when they go to give birth, their child is almost immediately apprehended. And that continues because it was happening so frequently. They had to pass legislation to ban them across the country. But as we know, and is that like racism, it shapeshifts. You can hardly ever put but it continues on. And the conversations that I've had with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous physicians is that, yes, birth alerts have been banned, but they still happen. They just look and sound different now. And so when people talk about the crisis in child welfare, I put quotations around it because it is so manufactured, but we don't look at it that way.
Right. Because crisis implies it's something new.
Or that it's just this obtuse, oh my gosh, how did this happen? Out of nowhere. Yeah. Did it really? No. So, yeah.
Another phrase you talked about when we met before was millennial scoop.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't heard that. Is that just the idea that it's still happening, or is there something else there?
It's still happening. And so one of the mechanisms is, of course, the birth alerts, but and I think it's millennium.
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 Yeah,
I don't want to
that makes more sense.
Drag millennials into it.
That might have been my own bias.
No. Yeah. So certain points. So we have residential schools, then we have 60 scoop, then we have millennium scoop. And so Patrick Johnson, I think, was the first to really put down on paper that this was happening, because he was seeing really troubling trends in the data in Alberta in particular. And so but what he was seeing and what has happened over the years is this just incremental rise to what we see today, where in Manitoba, I think it's 91 or 92% of all kids in care are Indigenous. Here in Alberta, incrementally, it's gone up to, I think, 78 or 79% of, let's say, 10,000 kids in care, 11,000 kids in care. And all of that seems abstract, right? Because it's just numbers, and who cares about 1%? But so when it's rendered that way, or we conceive of it that way, it's just numbers, really. And until we reach 92%, then it becomes a humanitarian crisis. And even when we try to introduce legislation that would prevent the apprehension of children, Indigenous children in particular, because of poverty, which is what Manitoba's done, it still rises. So that structure of colonization continues to move forward. And so what we have now is the millennium scoop, which is just this manufactured state where policy just keeps, right? And this framework of risk, which is based purely on material standards of care, right? As opposed to like if you were to ask me, how would I define risk for an Indigenous kid? I would say nearly every site, every settler colonial space that they enter into is a risk for them, as opposed to, mom of four, second generation residential school survivor, university educated, is at risk because she can't afford a 4-bedroom apartment to make sure her kids have enough space against these material standards of care. Like I shifted a little bit.
Yeah, and that's so important. I mean, the idea that any settler space is the riskiest place for them to be, and yet our systems are all about putting them in those spaces.
I did maybe 5 years ago, I did some work with End Poverty Edmonton because we were trying to understand like how to create like what would be a system of early learning and care that would be responsive to Indigenous peoples. And so we held talking circles, and the report from that was heartbreaking because what I heard from them was that every Indigenous participant, 100% of them, had intersected with the child welfare system in trying to access childcare, basic services. So every site that they went to was a place of risk for them. And so it became less about like what's an effective childcare space. It's more like, how about every time I go to take my kid to daycare, I don't face the existential threat of having them apprehended. And that it was in schools, it was in doctors' offices, it was in daycares, it was in shopping centers, it was on transit. Because anyone can call social services. So every site is a site of risk. That is just a structure. It's not an event. It's ongoing. It's everywhere. That they're part of it, and that it's been carefully constructed, and they just don't know. They can't see it. Don't know the contours of it, but it operates and controls them. Are you gently disinvite me from being on your podcast again?
I want to invite you to be on 100 more times because I just think there's so many more directions to go with these conversations. But I'm wondering about the listeners who will walk away from this conversation uncomfortable. And I think I get that with a lot of interviews I do. What do you hope they do with that discomfort?
Sit with it. And realizing it, they don't have to resolve it. Like it doesn't have to be solved. You can sit with the discomfort because there's something that's trying to tell you. So just sit with it until whatever emerges, and then sit with that. I like to say that I hold a black belt in holding awkward silence, but I also hold a black belt in sitting with discomfort. So like I'm okay with conflict, I'm okay with discomfort, and anyone in my life can tell you. And so when I offer that advice, it comes from that place because I've learned so much from it. There's so much to be learned from the space of discomfort because that's calling on you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been the most important lesson I've learned in the last 5 years. That once I learned that I could just do that, it changed everything.
And you didn't die, right? But did you die? No.
And what about the Indigenous listeners that are carrying exhaustion from constantly having to explain these realities? What would you say to those folks?
Well, first, hi. I see you. You're not alone. And I hope that because there was part of this that said that it's okay to disengage. that you don't actually have to explain, you don't actually have to fight, you don't have to and it's okay. And there are people who are actively resisting in that way. And so to save yourself. And that's the thing, like we are a non-renewable resource. We're turning back to our part of the conversation around extraction and consumption. We as a peoples are a non-renewable resource. If we must do the things to preserve ourselves in this space and to do the work the creator has put us here to do. And we can't do that if we're chasing Frank down the road, trying to tell him, like, like trying to convince Frank to be a good relative. Like, that's not creator's path for us, I don't think. So if you find any comfort and are able to give yourself permission, I give you permission. Disengage.
Tibetha, this was so much more than I ever could have hoped it would have been.
Okay.
I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and share.
It's been an honor. Thank you. Yeah, it's been incredible. Thank you for holding space and for the way that you listen and the way that you ask questions. And it's important. Yeah, I feel safe, seen, and heard. And that's good. Thank you so much.
If this conversation resonated with you, or maybe even challenged you, I'd invite you to sit with that a little longer before moving on. And when you're ready, there are a few other Behaviour Speak episodes that continue this conversation in powerful ways. I'd recommend checking out episode 220 with Dr. Julie Smith-Ulanenemy, where we explore decolonizing mental health and what it means to move beyond Western frameworks of care. Also episode 132 with Rochelle Gladue, a conversation on culturally safe harm reduction and the importance of meeting people in ways that honor their lived experience and identity. And finally, episode 37 with Grant Bruno, where we talk about autism in First Nations communities and the realities families face navigating systems that weren't built for them. Each of these conversations brings a different lens, but they share a common thread: rethinking systems, relationships, and what it means to show up in a good way. As always, thanks for listening, for reflecting, and for being willing to do the work, whatever that looks like for you. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok, and subscribe to our YouTube page at Behaviour Speak. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.